I mean to give the French a damn good thrashing.
The British Army of the Napoleonic Wars, probably the most effective force we've ever deployed.
I know you can fire 3 rounds a minute, but what I want to know now is, can you stand?
Time and time again, our small expeditionary army took on and beat the mighty French. But what was our secret? Well, today we're looking at one important aspect, the British Regiment. How were our infantry and cavalry units organised? What's a troop, a squadron, a company and a platoon? What was different about the elite flank companies? In this episode I'm joined by the incredible historian Steve Brown. He's written all of these books that are on screen now, and his latest, volume 4 of his series on King George's army, is currently being finished off and will be available in 2025. I started off by asking Steve to explain something that might seem obvious, but actually is quite complicated: the difference between a regiment and a battalion.
It really depends on whether you are talking cavalry or infantry. Cavalry regiments have and had no battalions. A cavalry regiment is a singular entity that contains troops, which then combine to form squadrons, and it is a self-contained entity in that form. Infantry regiments, on the other hand, can contain multiple battalions, whereby each one is a standalone entity with its own set of field officers, its own set of company officers, its own set of corporals and privates and NCOs, etc., and its own staff. Typically, in the British Army at the time, most regiments had anywhere from 2 all the way up to 8, which is the largest example. And the 60th, the Royal American Regiment, had 8 battalions ultimately.
60th Rifles reporting for duty, sir!
Although only 4 for a lot of that period. But that only really largely came into place after 1803 with the expansion of the army. Once Napoleon came to the throne. During the 1790s, most infantry regiments were only a single battalion. And what you're pulling up on screen there it gives you some idea of supporting what I've just said, that in December 1802, as you can see, there were not many more battalions than regiments, because most regiments were a single battalion. But by September 1814, there's a slight increase in the number of infantry regiments, but almost a twofold increase in the number of battalions, and the numbers of regiments with 2 battalions went from a solitary one in 1802 to 71, which is to say most of the army. 4 regiments ultimately had 3 battalions, and the 60th Foot, and indeed the 1st Foot, the Royal Scots, had multiple battalions. The Royal Scots had 4, and the 60th Foot went all the way up to 8, largely through the conscription and recruiting of foreign troops, and it was mainly intended as a garrison regiment, and it spent an awful lot of its time overseas.
Yeah.
The other thing you're seeing on there is a little bit of information about the structure, and this is a thing called establishment, which is all about what was the authorised establishment of a regiment, which is really how many troops it was intended to contain, and that was by no means a fixed thing. It varied considerably. It varied by year. It varied by the theatre that the regiment was serving in. It varied by battalion. So an infantry regiment might have different establishments for its 1st battalion as against its 2nd. So it's by no means a absolute entity, and it can change every year. Each December, a regiment could get a new establishment, and in about 1802, the establishment went from 750 rank and file in a battalion to generally multiples of 20, so 400, 600, 800, 1,000. In 1793, a typical British infantry regiment had 10 companies. It had a regimental colonel who was invariably a general officer who was concerned with the administration and so on of the regiment, the lieutenant colonel who was the substantive commander, and a major who was effectively the second in command. I hasten to add that this is typical, and this is by no means universal, so there could be variations on this, but this is probably the most common iteration of this. The lieutenant colonel therefore had reporting to him the major, to whom the 10 company commanders reported. He also had the surgeon, he had the quartermaster, the adjutant, very important role, and the chaplain, which existed in the regiments at the time, didn't later on. Each of the 10 companies was commanded by a captain with several junior officers and a complement of sergeants, corporals, privates, and musicians. One really strange quirk about infantry regiments at this time was that the first three companies were technically commanded by the colonel, the lieutenant colonel, and the major. The lieutenant colonel and the major were usually present on campaign, but the colonel never was, because he was usually a geriatric general officer sitting at home. And therefore, the senior lieutenant in the regiment was dubbed captain and lieutenant, which is a bureaucratic way of saying we want you to do a captain's job but for a lieutenant's pay and command the colonel's company. It wasn't until 1803 that that rule was scrapped and all companies were commanded by captains. So that's your typical infantry battalion in 1793. Yeah, cavalry regiments typically at that time had 6 troops. Very similar arrangement at the top of the tree: regimental colonel, lieutenant colonel commanding, the major as his 2IC, chaplain, adjutant, surgeon. Each of the 6 troops was commanded by a captain, but again, in the same vein, the 3 most senior officers technically commanded troops. When on the battlefield, usually a pair of troops was doubled up to form a squadron under the command of the more senior of the 2 captains of the 2 troops. Invariably, and I'm thinking particularly in Flanders in 1794, 1795, and also at the Helder in 1799, your typical cavalry regiment of 6 troops would only send 4 troops overseas. They'd always leave 2 troops at home for recruiting, training, reinforcements, etc., etc. So that gives you some idea. And in 1793, the cavalry regiments were actually relatively weak. And if you look on screen there, they only got 2 corporals and 38 privates per troop. So it's about 40 effectives, as they call them, the guys to do the actual wielding of the swords. So you've got a typical cavalry regiment strength of somewhere in the region of about 300 men, maybe slightly less, maybe 280. So they weren't terribly strong.
And shall I pull up the cavalry regiments for 1814 so we can see how that changed throughout the course of the war?
Yeah, absolutely. In 1814, most cavalry regiments had 10 troops, and some indeed had 12. Typically, regiments had 2 lieutenant colonels and 2 majors, which gave them considerable tactical flexibility. It also meant that they had more senior field officers to be filched by high command to fulfill staff positions, but that's another story. The senior lieutenant colonel had reporting to him not only the junior lieutenant colonel and the majors, but also the paymaster, the adjutant, the surgeon, and the quartermaster. The adjutant I haven't mentioned, which is a fairly important post, was actually filled usually by a junior officer, usually a lieutenant, occasionally a captain, responsible for orders, discipline and training. The adjutant had reporting to him the sergeant major and various staff sergeants like the armourer sergeant, the schoolmaster sergeant and the saddler sergeant, as forming the kind of headquarters staff of the company, of the troop, or the regiment I should say. And the various roles like the paymaster had a paymaster sergeant to assist, the surgeon had various assistant surgeons, and of course there was a quartermaster as well, which is very important.
And did they still leave 2 troops at home whenever they deployed generally? Was that still the case?
Yeah, I mean, by 1812, 1813, most cavalry regiments had 10 troops. They often campaigned with either 6 or 8 troops, more typically 6, and leaving the other troops at home. Generally, they always campaigned with an even number of troops so that they can pair them up into squadrons. It did vary. It was by no means a golden rule that it was going to be 6 or 8, but rarely did they ever take all 10 troops on campaign.
And I know, as you said, this is sort of typical, but things did change. Did it vary between light and heavy cavalry, or was this generally fairly universal between the 2?
This was relatively universal, but there were some changes, or there were some variances, I guess you'd say, in the household cavalry, because the household troops, as indeed I believe they are to this day, are a bit of a law unto themselves and like to have their own organisational and structural and nomenclature variations to the line.
Brilliant. I think let's skip forward to the infantry structure of 1814 as well. How had that changed from 1793?
The number of companies really had not changed. It was still 10 companies. There were still 2 flank companies, the Grenadier Company and the Light Company being the flankers, as well as 8 what I call centre or battalion companies. As per the cavalry, there was an increase in the number of field officers. This shows a single lieutenant colonel and 2 majors. Occasionally, there might have been 2 lieutenant colonels, usually in the 1st battalion rather than the 2nd. But there was also more staff usually attached, and the battalions tend to be bigger. And in most infantry battalions in 1793 were typically 400 men. By 1814, most 1st battalions were either 800 or 1,000 men, and many 2nd battalions were either 600 or 800 men. So there was a big change in the strength of the battalions, and therefore more officers and more NCOs were needed. Within the battalion, the adjutant was still there with the sergeant major and the various staff sergeants supporting. A quartermaster was, of course, important, with a quartermaster sergeant to assist, paymaster, the paymaster sergeant, and the surgeon with various assistant surgeons. The surgeon, paymaster, and quartermaster all ranked as junior officers and received pay as such. The adjutant, as I mentioned, was usually a junior officer who was appointed to the role. And because it involved a quite good understanding of how to administer training, how to deliver orders, how to keep the bookwork up to date, quite often adjutants were promoted NCOs, given commissions as adjutants, and a lot of officers who came from the ranks actually came up that way. It was a fairly common career path.
So I just want to briefly interrupt to tell you about 2 top blokes whose work I think you should also look up if you love British military history. One of them is my good mate Cam Simpson. He's got a fantastic history Substack page over at camsimpson.substack.com. Cam really knows his stuff. I learn from him every day, and I think you'll really enjoy the page. And then finally, my mate Bill Molyneux. Now, Bill's a lovely guy, he emails me regularly, he's got his own YouTube channel about military history in the United States, and he also makes and sells these games on screen now. Of course, I was fascinated as soon as I saw he's got one called The Horns of the Buffalo about the Anglo-Zulu War, but he's also got games on the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. Be sure to check those out. Okay guys, thanks for the interlude, let's get back to the interview with Steve. So the battalion of the era, Steve, was built around certain building blocks, whether that be companies, platoons and so on. Can you just talk us through exactly how that would have been organised?
It really all springs from the authorised establishment of the regiment, because, if an infantry regiment has an authorised establishment of 1,000 rank and file, then that boils down to 10 companies of 100 men in each. And when I say rank and file, I mean corporals and privates, which is what they called effectives, because they were the people holding muskets in the line of battle, which was the important criteria. On the right there, you can see a page snipped out of Dundas's drill regulations, where he talks about platoons falling in 3 ranks. Well, it was interesting. He was following the Prussian practice, which is in 1788 when he wrote it. He was thinking, 3 ranks is the norm, but in fact, as we probably heard on numerous occasions, that certainly in the Wellingtonian era it was always 2 ranks. But what was interesting, he talks about the section should be a minimum of 5 files, and if that was 3 ranks, then that's a section is at least 15 privates. But in reality, there was a local variance to suit the actual strength, so that if you've got a really small battalion of let's say only 30 men, which could happen on campaign, there's no point trying to subdivide a 30-strong company into 2 platoons, because the platoons are going to be ridiculously small. So what happened was the 30-strong company was considered 1 platoon. But if you're at the other end of the scale and you've got a company that's 120 strong, which was actually quite typical in the Foot Guards, that was often divided into 2 or 3 or 4 platoons and typically 8 sections. Platoons, sections, and companies were tactical formations covered in standing orders. What was not a tactical formation but was commonly used was the squad, which is typically a corporal and 19 privates, which is really the building block of the battalion. And it's the 20 strong block from which you get battalion strengths of 400, 600, 800, because 20 neatly goes into that. But it was really a mess grouping. The corporal was responsible for his 19 privates in his squad. But it also had some credence when battalions were either on parade or forming line of battle on the battlefield. So I've put this together. This is my interpretation from reading standing orders, and standing orders could vary from regiment to regiment. So this is not 100% guaranteed as being valid for every single instance, but I think this is a fairly typical representation of a way a company would be deployed on the battlefield. The captain commanding the company is on the first post of honour, which is the right-hand end of the line. The right-hand end of the line is always the first post of honour. Commanding the company, not riding about out front, definitely not on a horse, and not, American Civil War style with his hat on the end of his sword waving it in a big spiral in front of the troops. That didn't happen. Very much keeping alignment. Behind him is the senior NCO, and this is after 1813, I'm assuming, so that the senior NCO being the colour sergeant, which at the time was effectively the company sergeant major, but it wasn't called that.
Yeah.
Covering the officer with his pike. You then have the first platoon, which is the 20 men, or the 20 files, I should say, either to the left of the company commander, with a corporal on the right-hand end of the line and a lance corporal on the left-hand end of the line to check alignment. The lance corporal being probably the most dependable of the privates, bearing in mind that lance corporal at that time wasn't actually a rank; it was a title given temporarily to a man to effectively put in a position of, I guess, being an apprentice to a corporal, and so that he's able to step up at an appropriate moment if the corporal goes down.
And would he have worn a stripe? Would the lance corporal have worn a stripe, or that was a later thing?
Only in some regiments. The Foot Guards, I believe, wore a single stripe. The 95th Rifles, if you remember your Sharp series, had a white stripe which ran horizontally around their arm. Some other regiments, I think, did use stripes, but mostly they didn't.
Right.
It's my understanding. On the right-hand side of the image, you've got the second platoon, which has got the senior lieutenant commanding it on the right, with his covering sergeant behind him, and again, the lance corporals on the left-hand end of the line to check the dressing. And then in the third rank behind, you've got the supernumerary officers, the second of the lieutenants, and the ensign, which is the most junior officer, with their covering sergeants and the two drummers. So that is the way that a company would typically deploy itself on a battlefield, or probably on the parade square as well. If we move along to the next slide, you get to see what that looks like if you're the French infantrymen approaching a 600-strong battalion up the slope. So you've got the colour party in the centre, and the colour party is two ensigns who've been selected on roster to carry the colours, and I think 4 colour sergeants with their pikes protecting them. And then you've got the 10 companies, the Grenadier Company being on the right always, and the Light Company being on the left. And this image assumes that the Light Company were out skirmishing, but they've been recalled, so they've run back through the battalion, reformed themselves, and taken their place on the left-hand side of the line. Right. So it's quite a formidable. Imagine walking up the hill towards that.
I'm getting nervous just looking at it. I dread to think what it felt like for the French.
Yeah, well, you can imagine that's a 600-strong battalion. Imagine if you're approaching a 1,200-strong battalion of Foot Guards.
My word.
It's 190 metres from end to end.
Wow.
Which is why most of the British battalions at Waterloo spent the day in column, because there wasn't enough room to fit them all in.
Right.
on a fairly small battlefield.
Yeah.
They all had to stand in column beside each other.
So let's move on then to flank companies, shall we? That probably seems a good time to move over and discuss flank companies.
Well, flank companies, as I mentioned, you've always got the Grenadier Company on the right. You've got the Light Company on the left, and between them you've got 8 battalion companies. This graphic, and apologies to whoever prepared these little images, but they were too good not to use because they illustrated my point perfectly. Men in the flank companies wore wings, which are the funny looking things that sat on their shoulders. Men in the battalion companies wore tufts, which are like a ball of cotton bud on your shoulder. The centre companies had a white over red plume. Light companies had a green plume, and Grenadier companies had a white plume. And the chevrons altered according to what company you're in. So both arms for the flank companies, the right arm only for the centre companies. Grenadier Company men were, by and large, but not exclusively, selected for their size, their height, their experience. I mean, they were considered to be the stormtroopers within the battalion, so to speak, although that term was never used.
Yeah.
Well, the term stormers was used, but stormtroopers was never used. And from reviewing muster rolls for Grenadier Company troops, by and large, yes, they were a bit taller than average. But there is a myth that men in the light company were at the other end of the scale. They were all the short guys. And that is absolutely not true. I've looked at many muster rolls for light company men, and they were at least the same height as men in the battalion companies, and which makes perfect sense because the criteria for being a light company man was to be fit, agile, independently minded, able to operate in skirmish order on your own, and be an extremely good shot. And that's had nothing to do with height, or build. Agility and fitness were probably important things. So they were very careful as to most battalions were very careful who they put into the flank companies that fit that criteria. And men could be transferred between the two, and often were. And new recruits could be sorted to the flank companies if they seemed to fit the bill.
Because I don't know if it's a hangover from the Sharpe novels, but I feel like light companies in our modern interpretation of the era get all the glory as these, very, very clever independent troops who would sort of sneak behind enemy lines and, I don't know, steal chickens and shoot generals and things. And I feel like grenadiers don't really get their the kudos they deserve.
Yeah, it was not uncommon in continental armies to create converged battalions of grenadiers, and particularly in the Austrian army, and the French did it. The French did it at Vimiero. They had an entire brigade of converged grenadier companies. They basically stripped the grenadier companies out of all the line regiments and lumped them all together as an elite formation that was sent in to assault in the middle of the battle. The British did it a little bit in the early years of the war. For example, in the West Indies in 1794, there were 3 light battalions and 3 grenadier battalions used, and they were far and away the best troops in the force at that time. But the practice on that fell away. I mean, in the peninsula, the closest that it came to was that the light companies of the various battalions of a brigade could be converged together to form a composite light battalion, but only for that brigade. So it might be 3 or 4 light companies operating under usually a major, might act as an independent formation and then revert back to their battalions when the battle was over. So that was as close as it came to it in the later years. As I mentioned earlier, there are differences in the number of officers, so that a centre company usually got in addition to the captain, a couple of lieutenants and an ensign. In the grenadier companies and the light companies, they never had ensigns. Each company always had 2 drummers, but the grenadier company got an added bonus of 2 fifers, so that it could play British Grenadiers as they marched along, a la Barry Lyndon. Which, must have been a lot more interesting to listen to than the rubbity dub of the drummers.
Steve and I covered a lot of ground in this chat, and so I've saved some segments to use in the new year. Watch this space for that. We're going to look at recruitment, we're going to look at training, loads of good stuff. In the meantime, YouTube thinks you're going to enjoy the video that's on screen now.